thank you for sticking it out this long. Section 1, the right to freedom of scientific research. Scientific freedom has been called the elixir of civilization, and scientists' right to such freedom is recognized and protected worldwide. The United Nations, for example, has directed states to, quote, respect the freedom indispensable for scientific research and creative activity, unquote. The European Union has acted similarly. According to Article 13 of its Charter of Fundamental Rights, quote, the arts and scientific research shall be free of constraint. Academic freedom shall be respected, unquote. Other international documents also contain such directives, such as the Declaration of the 2006 World Congress for Freedom of Scientific Research, which states that freedom of scientific research, quote, is a basic civil and political right. Indeed, is a dimension of freedom of thought and freedom of speech that is a requirement of democracy, unquote. The constitutions of many nations, such as Germany, Italy, Greece, and Spain, contain similar directives, while other nations, such as the United States and Canada, protect the freedom of scientific research in other ways. For example, via the First Amendment of the Constitution in the U.S., and via Article 2 of the Canadian Charter of Fundamental Rights and Freedoms in Canada. As a result, encroachments on scientific freedom are met with alarm. Think not only of the recent heated debates concerning stem cell research, but also of the extensive, sometimes passionate literatures surrounding the politicization and commercialization and militarization of science. In a world where science policy is increasingly influenced by politics, economics, and religion, this is a quote, said University of Alberta law professor Timothy Caulfield in The Lancet in 2004, the concept of scientific freedom has never been more important, unquote. But how much freedom do scientists really need or deserve? The very question seems anathema. Interference with the conduct of scientific research violates scientists' rights and threatens the scientific enterprise. And yet, all the covenants and charters and constitutions that recognize these rights to freedom of research at the same time recognize, whether explicitly or implicitly, other important rights that can conflict with the right to freedom of research. For example, the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the European Union also recognizes the right to human dignity in Article 1, and the right to the integrity of the person in Article 3. I won't read you the quotes from all these things. The Charter also recognizes the right to equality between men and women. In Article 23, I'll read you that one. Equality between men and women must be ensured in all areas, including employment, work, and pay, unquote. And it prohibits sex-based and other kinds of discrimination in Article 21. Furthermore, the Charter recognizes the right to environmental protection in Article 37, and so on. Asking how much freedom scientists really need or deserve thus involves asking how the conflict between the right to freedom of research and these other rights is to be resolved. Only by resolving the conflict do we gain a clear understanding of the extent and depth of scientists' right to freedom of research. Of course, the answer in some areas is already largely settled. The right to human dignity and the integrity of a person, and the right to environmental protection are already recognized to be constraints on scientists' right to freedom of research. Constraints as politically legitimate as the national and international declarations that recognize the right to freedom of scientific research in the first place. Scientists are no more free in the way they conduct their research to compromise the safety or dignity of research participants than they are to endanger the environment. But what of other rights and their possible conflict with the right to freedom of research? Section 2, a case study, the right to equality versus the right to freedom of research. Consider the right to equality between men and women, and between people of different racial and ethnic groups. It has been thought that certain kinds of scientific research threaten the enforcement of this right. For example, research looking for gender or race-linked differences in intelligence, particularly biologically based differences in intelligence. After all, in the words of well-known UK neuroscientist Stephen Rose, and it's a quote, claims that there are differences in intelligence between blacks and whites, or men and women, have always been used to justify a social hierarchy in which white males continue to occupy the premier positions, whether in the economy in general or natural science in particular, unquote. As a result, it has been debated for years whether scientists should pursue this kind of cognitive differences research. And since many have come away from the debate concluding that scientists should not, the funding and other supports for the research have sometimes been in short supply. As Cornell University developmental psychologists Stephen Ceci and Wendy Williams, distinguished contributors to this cognitive differences research, but critics of biologically based cognitive differences point out, and this is a quote, "We think racial and gender differences in IQ are not innate, but instead reflect environmental challenges. But whereas our politically correct work garners us praise, speaking invitations, and book contracts, challengers are demeaned, ostracized, and occasionally threatened with tenure revocation," unquote. And they go on to remind us of such recent goings-on as the forced resignation of former Harvard University President Lawrence Summers in 2006 after his speech supporting biologically based gender differences in intelligence, and the suspension of Nobel laureate James Watson from the chancellorship of Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory in 2007 after his remarks in a newspaper interview supporting biologically based race differences in intelligence. Others, such as science writer Morton Hunt, recount the experiences of Arthur Jensen, H.J. Eisenach, J. Philippe Rushton, Charles Murray, Julian Stanley, Camilla Benbow, and other famous race and gender theorists. How, for example, Jensen, longtime proponent of genetic race-linked differences in intelligence, had great difficulty finding a publisher for his major work, The G Factor, even though he had previously published with such distinguished presses as Methuen, the Free Press, Columbia University Press, and the U.S. Office of Education. How major professional organizations condemned his views or called for his expulsion from the American Psychological Association. How other academics argued in journal articles that research like his should not be pursued, and so on. Concludes science writer Morton Hunt. Far less, and this is a quote, "far less virulent and widespread criticism than this by fellow academics has often been enough to choke off a researcher's interest in a troublemaking topic and cause him or her to turn to safer research subjects," unquote. Within the area of cognitive differences research, then, the right to gender and racial equality has seemed to many to conflict with the right to freedom of research. And the right to gender and racial equality has seemed to them to take precedence, to legitimately constrain scientists' right to freedom of research. Oh my, so much of that page. A closer look at the situation, however, yields problems with this analysis. After all, the virulent and widespread so-called academic criticism referred to above, directed at scientists such as Jensen, has tended to be legitimate scientific criticism, though scientific criticism frequently motivated by egalitarian political values, and frequently laden with more than the usual amount of acrimony. The criticism has dealt, for example, with the way the offending cognitive differences research has tried to make biological sense of the social category of race, despite the genetic diversity within any socially defined, for example, black or white or Asian racial group. There are, for example, hundreds of different genetic subpopulations among blacks in Africa alone, encompassing much of the global genetic diversity of the human population at large. The criticism has dealt with the way the offending cognitive differences research has tried to capture with a single, culture-free IQ number and IQ ranking system the diverse forms of intelligent behavior. That one wasn't fine. The diverse forms of intelligent behavior of persons in diverse circumstances, or with the way the research has simply ignored all of this diversity. And the criticism has dealt with the way the offending cognitive differences research has tried to identify innate biological links to any differences in the way women and men think and act, despite the different treatments men and women receive from the moment they are born, and the pervasive ways these different treatments end up shaping women's and men's biologies. What's more, the continuing dialogue between the scientists producing the offending cognitive differences research and their critics has generated important new areas of research and important new insights concerning race, gender, and intelligence, such as discovery of the ongoing upward rise in IQ scores from one generation to the next, known as the Flynn effect, showing that IQ scores are not simply a function of biology, and the discovery of the dramatically decreasing gender gap in test scores in math and science-related achievement tests over the past several decades, showing that these scores as well do not simply reflect biology. And most of this new research and new knowledge has supported rather than threatened gender and racial equality. Within the area of cognitive differences research, then, the conclusion has seemed to many to be that the right to freedom of research has not only not conflicted with the right to gender and racial equality, but has actually supported that right. But there are problems also with this analysis. For notice that all of this new research and all of this new knowledge have been a response, positive or negative, to the claims of intellectual inferiority leveled against such groups as blacks and women, made within the context of a still sexist and racist society. And notice also that these claims are as old as science itself, and that they never seem to cease. For centuries, for example, scientists have claimed that women are intellectually inferior to men. And for centuries, the basis for such inferiority has been located in biology. In the 17th century, women's brains were claimed to be too cold and soft to sustain rigorous thought. In the late 18th century, the female cranial cavity was claimed to be too small to hold a powerful brain. In the late 19th century, the exercise of women's brains was claimed to be damaging to women's reproductive health, was claimed in fact to shrivel women's ovaries. In the 20th century, the lesser lateralization, that's to say hemispheric specialization, of women's brains compared to men's was claimed to make women inferior in visuospatial skills, including mathematical skills. And now, in the beginning of the 21st century, the claims continue. That women's brains are smaller than men's brains, even correcting for differences of body mass. That women's brains have less white matter, axonal material. That women's brains have less focused cortical activity, that's to say lower neural efficiency. That women's brains have lower cortical processing speed, that's to say lower conduction velocity in their white matter's axons, and so on. And once again, these differences are being linked to differences in intellectual capacity. That people with smaller brains have lower IQ test scores. That less focused cortical activity is associated with lower intellectual performance. That lower cortical processing speed is associated with lower working memory performance, which is correlated with lower fluid intelligence scores, and so on. At the same time, much attention now focuses on the mappings of brain activity produced by brain imaging, particularly fMRIs, as a functional magnetic resonance imaging, and the differences in emotional intelligence these disclose. But once again, the male brain, the systemizer brain, comes out on top. Is the more scientific brain, the more innovative brain, the more leadership-oriented brain, the more potentially elite brain. than the female brain, the empathizer brain. Of course, the above is just a peek at the history of scientific claims about women's intellectual inferiority. The claims include not only these about the structure and function of women's brains, but also claims about women's hormones, and women's psychological propensities, and women's genetic endowment, and women's evolutionary past, how all these are connected to intellectual inferiority. And the claims go back in history at least to Aristotle, and his observation that women are literally misbegotten men, barely rational at all. And though the claims of intellectual inferiority continue to be contested and corrected, they also continue to be made. And the endless succession of claims and counterclaims both feeds on and helps to sustain the stereotype of intellectual inferiority associated with women. Meanwhile, the effects are profound. For example, studies have documented the harm done to women and girls by the publication of scientific claims suggesting an innate female deficit in mathematics. Reports one of the researchers involved in these studies, social personality psychologist Stephen Hine of the University of British Columbia, and I quote, "As our research demonstrates, just hearing about that sort of idea, that female underachievement in mathematics is due to genetic factors rather than social factors, is enough to negatively affect women's performance and reproduce the stereotype that is out there," unquote. But that harm has been recognized for years. Virginia Woolf described it almost a century ago in her essay, A Room of One's Own, and I quote, "There was an enormous body of masculine opinion to the effect that nothing could be expected of women intellectually. Even if her father did not read out loud these opinions, any girl could read them for herself. And the reading, even in the 19th century, must have lowered her vitality and told profoundly upon her work. There would always have been that assertion, you cannot do this, you are incapable of doing that, to protest against, to overcome." Of course, much the same can be said of race differences research and the harm that it has caused. Should the conclusion then be that in the case of cognitive differences research, the right to freedom of research does conflict with the right to gender and racial equality, and hence ought to be constrained by that right? Certainly many scientists have thought so. In a 2-month-long debate in the journal Nature in 2009, University of North Carolina anthropologist Jonathan Marks spoke for many when he said, quote, "Decisions about what kinds of scholarly research questions and methods are considered worthy of attention and funding are fundamental to modern science. Stupid science and evil science should not be permitted to coexist casually alongside the normative intellectual activities we admire. Any science that takes all work to be of equal stature necessarily calls into question its own standing as a scholarly enterprise," unquote. In other words, restricting scientists from pursuing evil questions, questions unworthy of science, such as those that act to undermine the right to equality, is fundamental to science. Others in the debate, however, took the opposite stand. The psychologists Stephen Ceci and Wendy Williams proclaimed, quote, "When scientists are silenced by colleagues, administrators, editors, and funders who think that simply asking certain questions is inappropriate, the process begins to resemble religion rather than science. Under such a regime, we risk losing a generation of desperately needed research," unquote. New Zealand University of Otago psychologist James Flynn, of Flynn Effect fame, agreed, quote, "As the philosopher John Stuart Mill points out, when you assert that a topic is not to be debated, you are foreclosing not some narrow statement of opinion on that topic, but the whole spiraling universe of discourse that it may inspire." And he added that, "I invite everyone to search the social science literature of the past 34 years and ask whether or not they really wish that everything on the subject of biologically based cognitive group differences, pro or con, was missing," unquote. In other words, restricting scientists from pursuing evil questions, questions unworthy of science, such as those that act to undermine the right to equality, is antithetical to science and thwarts scientific progress. Clearly, the conflict between the right to freedom of research and the right to equality remains unresolved. Well, how might it be resolved? A plausible strategy, I think, would be to consider past precedents. Cases in which the conflict between the right to freedom of research and other rights has been effectively resolved. Then we can try to model the resolution we seek on these other cases. Section 3, past precedents. Consider then 3 precedents that involve the right to freedom of research. The first 2 are relatively familiar, so discussion of them will be brief. Until the U.S. National Institutes of Health Revitalization Act was passed in 1993, women and minority men tended to be neglected in U.S. biomedical research, left out of clinical drug trials, left out of the definitions of diseases, left out of research agendas, their health needs largely ignored. What the Revitalization Act did was mandate the equal inclusion with white men of women and minority men in publicly funded U.S. biomedical research and make funding contingent on that inclusion. This surely formed a constraint on scientists' freedom to design their own research programs, and it was justified by women's and minority men's right to equality. In this case, their right to equality of access to health care. Similarly, the earlier U.S. National Research Act of 1974 mandated the formation of institutional review boards to oversee all research that receives funding from what is now the Department of Health and Human Services. These review boards, themselves regulated by the Office for Human Research Protection of the Department of Health and Human Services, can reject, modify, or suspend any medical or behavioral research that fails to protect the rights and welfare, this is the right to life, the right to autonomy, the right to human dignity, and so on, of its human subjects. So here again, science's right to freedom of research has been constrained by other rights. Can a new constraint to protect human rights, this time in the area of cognitive differences research, be modeled on these 2 cases? Certainly there are important similarities among the 3. All 3 rule out as unacceptable harmful kinds of scientific inquiry, and thereby shape the kinds of knowledge scientific inquiry can deliver. But they do not shape that knowledge in any other way. So none can be said to censor particular kinds of knowledge. The National Research Act rules out as unacceptable harmful procedures for obtaining knowledge, not harmful kinds of knowledge. If other ways are found to obtain the knowledge without harming research participants, that is perfectly acceptable, regardless of the content of the knowledge in question. The Revitalization Act rules out as unacceptable harmful, exclusionary, and neglectful kinds of research agendas, though it says nothing about the content of the knowledge that is gathered with those with those agendas. If it turns out that one or another group is, say, more prone to disease, that is also acceptable, though of course unfortunate. In the same way, a constraint on cognitive differences research would rule out as unacceptable the kinds of harmful gender and racial group comparison questions that are included in that research, and thereby the answers to those questions that continue to be circulated. Though we would do this regardless of the content of the answers. That is, regardless of whether they bespeak equality or inequality of the groups in question. Of course, ruling such questions out is controversial. Jonathan Marks, remember, maintained that science should rule such questions out because they are evil, whereas Stephen Ceci and Wendy Williams maintained that science should rule no questions out, evil or not. But if such questions are evil, that is genuinely harmful to women and minority men, then surely they should be ruled out, in just the way in which the 2 other harmful kinds of scientific inquiry described above have been ruled out. And if so, a resolution of the conflict between the right to freedom of research and the right to equality in the area of cognitive differences research is at hand, one modeled on our first two precedents. At this point, you will protest. There is nothing intrinsically evil or harmful, you will say, about seeking to determine who is better at something, or about seeking to determine whether some are as good at something as others. Else everything from spelling bees and team sports to college entrance examinations and the Nobel Prize would be ruled out of bounds. What is problematic about cognitive differences research is not the questions asked or even the results sometimes obtained, but the prejudice, the racist and sexist context in which the research takes place. It is this context that makes the research disempowering. For example, whites do not feel demeaned or disempowered when it is reported that Asians have higher IQ scores than they. The result, in fact, seems of little consequence. IQ isn't everything. But when it is reported that whites have higher IQ scores than blacks, blacks do feel demeaned and disempowered. The difference, of course, is the racism that oppresses blacks and privileges whites. To be sure, finding out that blacks have lower IQ scores than whites, or that women are analytically weaker than men, could be the beginning of educational and training programs to work with the strengths and work on the weaknesses of every group to help make them the very best they can be, and even to use the special talents of each group to help the others. That this does not happen, or seldom happens, is a function of the sexism and racism of society, not the knowledge uncovered by cognitive differences research. In short, there is nothing wrong with cognitive differences research taken by itself. It is our society that is wrong, not the research. So why should we limit the freedom of scientists and the potentially interesting and important insights they might offer because of the shortcomings of the society in which they do their research? This is what I think you will say. And although the argument falls short of compelling, cognitive differences research, after all, is far less benign than spelling bees, team sports, and the Nobel Prize, with their emphases on motivating hard work and rewarding achievement. Still, the societal context of such research is surely significant. Turn then to the third of my three precedents, a very new case involving the conflict between the right to freedom of research and the right to personal security. That is, the right not to be killed and not to be injured or abused. In the U.S. Constitution, this is called the right to life. This time, the case comes from synthetic genomics investigations within biomedical research. Section 4, the third precedent. In 2001, Australian researchers inadvertently produced a superstrain of mousepox, one that kills mice regardless of whether they have been vaccinated against mousepox or are naturally resistant to it. What the researchers had hoped to achieve when they inserted the mouse IL-4 gene into the mousepox virus was an altered virus that would provide a means of pest control by sterilizing mice. What the researchers did achieve was not only the superstrain of mousepox, but very possibly also a technique for producing a superstrain of smallpox. In the wrong hands, this information could be deadly. Since there is no known treatment for smallpox, since vaccination is our only defense, having a vaccine-resistant strain of smallpox on the loose would produce havoc. As if this weren't enough, in a second study in 2002, researchers at the State University of New York at Stony Brook stitched together strands of DNA that they had purchased via mail order, following the map of the poliovirus RNA genome available on the internet. That technique resulted in the artificial synthesis of a live poliovirus, one that paralyzes and kills mice. In this case, however, the researchers produced their deadly virus deliberately, from scratch, using materials and information readily available to anyone. Indeed, in an interview in the New York Times after the publication of their paper, The researchers said that they, and this is their words, made the virus to send a warning that terrorists might be able to make biological weapons without obtaining a natural virus, unquote. In still further studies completed in 2005, researchers from the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology, Mount Sinai School of Medicine, and the U.S. Department of Agriculture pieced together viral fragments from hospital specimens and from the remains of a human victim dug up in Alaska to sequence the complete genome of the deadly Spanish flu virus. The virus that had killed an estimated 40 to 50 million people worldwide in the winter of 1918 to 1919. They then went ahead and recreated the virus, this virus that by then no longer existed anywhere on Earth. The recreated virus, the researchers found, was just as lethal as historical records had led them to expect. All the mice that were infected died within days. And Canadian, US, and Japanese researchers found the same outcome with monkeys in 2007. Note that all these groundbreaking studies were carried out by top researchers, and they all were published in top journals. The first in the Journal of Virology, and the others in Science and in Nature. And all these studies, as well as others that might have employed similar techniques to synthesize smallpox or Ebola, were said to promise unprecedented insights into some of the most virulent diseases ever known, and the kinds of drugs and vaccines that might be developed to combat them. Still, many have argued that these studies should not have been done at all, or at least that they should not have been published. Regarding the 1918 Spanish flu studies, for example, biosecurity experts have warned that, to use the wording given in a special report in Nature in 2005, the risk that the recreated strain might escape is so high it is almost a certainty. This is another quote. "There is a long history of things escaping," said one expert interviewed for the report. Said another, Tumpy et al., the researchers carried out the research of these studies, have constructed and provided procedures for others to construct a virus that represents perhaps the most effective bioweapons agent now known. For its part, the U.S. Sunshine Project, a biological weapons watchdog group, charged that the experiments, quote, will be replicated and adapted, and the ability to perform them will proliferate, meaning that the possibility of man-made disaster, either accidental or deliberate, has risen for the entire world, unquote. And an op-ed column in the New York Times by two other scientists, Ray Kurzweil and Bill Joy, warned that publishing the full genome of the 1918 influenza virus was like publishing the precise design for an atomic bomb. Indeed, it was much worse, since creating and releasing the virus from the published genetic data would be easier than building and detonating an atomic bomb from only its design, since rare materials like plutonium or enriched uranium would not be needed. And releasing the virus would kill many more people than detonating an atomic bomb. According to these experts, in short, the present age of terrorism, this is the term used, the age of terrorism in which the studies have been conducted, as well as the ever-present possibility of human error, have turned what the Centers for Disease Control called important health research into a very bad idea. So the context of research can shape the value of research. In biomedical research, given its context of terrorism, no less than in psychological research, given its context of sexism and racism. The controversial biomedical research described above, however, unlike the controversial psychological research described previously, has produced new policy constraints on the freedom of research. In 2003, for example, a joint statement on scientific publication and security appeared in Science, Nature, the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, and the Journals of the American Society for Microbiology. According to this statement, editors should screen and, if necessary, request modification of or or even refuse to publish manuscripts if the editors, quote, conclude that the potential harm of publication outweighs the potential societal benefits, unquote. In 2004, the U.S. National Research Council issued a comprehensive report entitled Biotechnology Research in an Age of Terrorism, commonly known as the Fink Report. This report, as well as others appearing around the same time, and there was one in the UK and there were others, emphasized the need for systematic reviews of potentially harmful life sciences research before the initiation of the research and at regular intervals thereafter, way before publication is at issue. The Fink report went on to identify the kinds of study that require this especially careful oversight, and it expanded the institutional framework already in place to carry out the oversight. It emphasized as well the need to develop a culture of responsibility within the life sciences to support and anticipate the oversight, to be accompanied by educational programs undertaken by all the professional societies in the life sciences, by group strategies coordinated by the major societies, and by the creation and promotion of codes of ethics detailing life scientists' social responsibilities. Finally, the Fink report recommended the establishment of a National Science Advisory Board for biosecurity to provide the necessary advice, guidance, and resources for both the scientific community and the government regarding the system of review and oversight it proposed. This board was created in 2004, and it included both leading scientists and biosecurity experts. Is there any reason new policy constraints like these for the social sciences should not be put into effect for this, is there any reason new policy constraints like these for the life sciences should not be put into effect for the social sciences? New policy constraints that include research guidelines for weighing societal harms of research against societal benefits, that include educational programs and codes of ethics designed to foster a culture of responsibility among social scientists, and that include a new National Science Advisory Board for social research to provide guidance, advice, and resources for both the scientific community and the government. Such a board could count among its members both leading social scientists and representatives of the public at large, such as racial, ethnic, and gender group advocates. Is there any reason new policy constraints like these should not be put into effect for the social sciences? Reflecting again on the two cases described above, one from the social sciences, the case of cognitive differences research, and one from the life sciences, the case of recent synthetic genomics research, two reasons might be offered to say that the cases should not be treated similarly. The first reason is that the cognitive differences research in question does not pose harms to society anywhere near the harms posed by the recent synthetic genomics research. Hence, there is no need for similar constraints on scientific freedom in the two cases. The second reason is that such constraints might have very different effects in the two cases, limiting scientific progress in the one case, but not in the other. What can be said in response to these considerations? To begin with, it is clear that the kinds of synthetic genomics research described previously may cause great harm to certain people. To the people who work in the laboratories in which the research is carried out. To the people who live near these laboratories, in whose midst the pathogens may escape. To the people who may end up targets of terrorist use of the published results of the research, and so on. All these people, under the old system of standards for choosing, carrying out, and publishing research, might have gotten sick, even very sick, even died as a result of the research, though the degree of likelihood for these various effects is hotly debated. As a result, special new constraints on scientific freedom were thought necessary to minimize the risks. So on the one hand, synthetic genomics research unconstrained may cause serious harm to various groups of people. On the other hand, cognitive differences research unconstrained, as previously stated, has already been shown to cause significant harm, though lesser harm than a serious illness, but for much longer periods than the length of an illness to lots more people. To all the people whose self-esteem and self-efficacy and ambitions and successes are lessened as a result of direct or indirect exposure to the research or aspects of the research, for example, its results or even just its questions. To all the people whose self-esteem and self-efficacy and ambitions and successes are lessened as a result of the treatment they receive from others who have been directly or indirectly exposed to the research or aspects of the research, and so on. In short, to all or most women, and in the United States at least, to most minority men, and many men of color in other parts of the world. And these harms have gone on for centuries to this majority of society. Cognitive group differences research then, arguably, does pose harms to society, near, perhaps even exceeding, the harms posed by the recent synthetic genomics research. If special constraints to scientific freedom are thought necessary in the one case, then why should they not be thought necessary in the other case as well? But decisions of this kind must take into account their expected effects on science as well as society. And in the case of health research, it is claimed that the new constraints on scientific freedom will not limit scientific progress. Indeed, this was one of the desiderata built into the new policy. As the Fink report made clear, quote, any system of review and oversight must operate in ways that do not put the United States and the world at risk of losing the great potential benefits of biotechnology, unquote. Some have gone further. They have claimed that even more stringent constraints than those now in place, constraints that would further restrict synthetic genomics research, will still not limit progress in health research, since the controversial genomics research was not really needed. For example, Jan van Aken, trained cell biologist, biological weapons expert, and former director of the Sunshine Project Germany, commenting on the 1918 Spanish flu studies in particular, has pointed out that, quote, hundreds of influenza strains from the past 5 decades, including some pandemic strains, are available to researchers and are used by initiatives such as the Influenza Genome Sequencing Project to investigate genetic virulence factors. The added value of one extra strain, even one with an exceptionally high mortality rate, is limited, given that strains with varying degrees of contagiousness and pathogenicity are already available and provide a wealth of research resources for comparative studies, unquote. So we have been assured that the new policy constraints on scientific freedom imposed on the life sciences will not limit scientific progress. But we can be equally assured that new policy constraints on scientific freedom in the social sciences will not limit scientific progress either. Indeed, we can write that into the policy, as the Fink report did. But we can also question, as advocates for tighter restrictions than the life sciences have done, exactly how important to the overall goals of the life sciences race and gender-related cognitive differences research really is. And we can also question the reasonableness of those goals that may make it important. For example, the synthetic genomics research described above has aroused great concern in the United States because of its national security implications. But surely cognitive differences research also has something akin to national security implications. After all, people of color from various national origins will soon be the majority in the United States, and women already are. As a result, the competence and productivity, indeed the flourishing of minority populations and women are becoming central to our collective well-being. A kind of research that undermines this competence and productivity, therefore, also undermines our security, and goals that support such research thereby become suspect. Of course, none of this precludes losses to society as well as science when scientists' freedom is constrained. Psychologist James Flynn's remarks, already quoted, in the Nature debate on cognitive differences research make this depressingly clear, and I quote again, When you assert that a topic is not to be debated, you are foreclosing not some narrow statement of opinion on that topic, but the whole spiraling universe of discourse that it may inspire. I invite everyone to search the social science literature of the past 34 years and ask whether or not they really wish that everything on the subject of biologically based cognitive group differences, pro or con, was missing, unquote. But Flynn never considers the gains that might have occurred along with the losses had cognitive group differences research not been pursued during the last 34 years. The research that might have done far more to dismantle race and gender-related injustice than the research to which Flynn and others contributed. Nor does Flynn consider the whole spiraling universe of discourse and benefits that might now ensue if we put a halt to the subject of cognitive group differences research. When we look at some of the newer work in child development in minority populations in the United States, how the old genetic deficit models and cultural deficit models of minority child development are being replaced by models that foreground and seek to build upon minority competences and strengths and resourcefulness in the context of racism and poverty. Or when we look at some of the work in feminist science studies over the last 30 years, how the old doubts whether women can make the same contributions to science as men have been replaced by studies showing the importantly different critical and constructive contributions to the sciences women have made. When we look at such work, we get a hint of what this new discourse and these new benefits can be. The work of Section 5, one paragraph. How much freedom do scientists really need or deserve? The three precedents considered above, the U.S. National Research Act of 1974, the U.S. National Institutes of Health Revitalization Act of 1993, and the Fink Report and related policy directives of 2003 and 2004, point to a resolution of the conflict between the right to freedom of research and the right to equality, a resolution that favors the right to equality. At least this seems to be the result in the context of cognitive group differences research. But the same result should follow in other contexts in which the right to freedom of research conflicts with the right to equality, such as in the context of public health and biomedical research, where the health needs of the more affluent are privileged over the health needs of the poor, and so on. In fact, taken together, the three precedents considered above suggest a quite general conclusion: that scientists' right to freedom of research cannot be allowed to subvert other people's rights, whether those other people are research subjects inside the research context or recipients of the effects of the research outside it. The case of cognitive group differences research, if enacted into a fourth precedent, will simply add further strength and urgency to this conclusion. It will also move science closer to the forefront of social change rather than remain holding up the rear. Thank you.